The quiet evening in our suburban home felt like a scene from a perfect life. I sat on the terrace, inhaling the cool evening air, listening to the faint sounds of nature. Tom, as usual, was absorbed in his work. His office on the second floor emanated a warm glow through the half-drawn curtains. Everything was as always, and there was something both comforting and suffocating about that. We loved each other, no doubt, but our lives had become predictable, lacking a spark. Every day was the same, breakfast together, talking about work, handling routine tasks. I often wondered when our life had turned into a series of familiar actions. I was lost in these thoughts when my phone rang. Glancing at the screen, I saw my father's name. He rarely called, and every time he did, it was significant, as our relationship was never particularly close. I pressed the answer button, trying not to create reasons for worry, though something deep inside me sensed a serious conversation was coming. "Hi, Dad." I tried to keep my voice calm despite the growing sense of unease. "Katie, we need to talk." His voice was quiet and tense. There was no usual strictness, but rather something anxious and heavy. My heart started to race. What could have happened? Why was he so serious? "What's going on?" My voice wavered and I felt my palms start to sweat. "There's something I should have told you a long time ago." My father sighed, and that sigh sounded like a warning, something that would forever change my life. "You have a brother." Those words echoed in my head, but I couldn't process them immediately. A brother? How could this be? I had never heard anything about him. My parents and I rarely talked about the past, but this was a shock. "What?" I barely breathed, feeling a wave of disbelief sweep through my body. Why didn't I know?" "It's not that simple," my father continued. "When you were born, your mother was a surrogate for an infertile family. Josh is 4 years older than you. We signed a non-disclosure agreement, a condition from the family who took him. By law, I couldn't tell you until you turned 30. I felt like the ground was slipping from under my feet. My mind refused to accept what I was hearing. My mother, a surrogate? A brother? 4 years older? This sounded like a story that belonged to someone else, not me. How could this be? Why had my father stayed silent all these years? "Are you serious?" I finally managed to ask. "How could you keep this from me?" "The terms were strict," he replied. "We had no right to say anything until you reached a certain age. And now, at 30, I can finally tell you the truth." The world I had lived in for years suddenly cracked open, revealing a completely different reality. Everything I thought I knew about my family now felt like a lie. This wasn't just a secret. This was something that upended my entire life. And now, I had to figure out how to live with it. "He wants to meet you," my father continued, as if delivering the final blow. "Josh lives in another city, but he'd like to get to know you." I didn't know how to respond. Inside, anger, confusion, and curiosity clashed. Meeting a person I didn't even know existed wasn't something I was prepared for. I tried to focus on my work, but thoughts of my brother wouldn't leave me alone. How could I go back to my ordinary life when such a revelation had turned everything upside down? Every meeting with colleagues, every phone call felt distant, almost unreal. I needed to throw myself into my routine, but all I could do was replay the conversation with my father in my mind. A brother. Josh, 4 years older. My mother, a surrogate. It all sounded like fragments from someone else's story, yet somehow it was mine. When Tom came home, I caught myself unable to tell him about the call. For some reason, it felt like this knowledge belonged solely to me, that if I shared it, my reality would shatter. Perhaps I feared Tom wouldn't understand, or that this news would change something between us. Maybe I just wasn't ready to speak it aloud, because that would make it too real. The whole day, I felt strange and unsettled. I hadn't told anyone about the call, but I couldn't shake the feeling that my life was on the verge of change. An inner tension built up, as if I stood on the edge of something unknown. In moments like these, I thought about Josh. What was he like? How did he live? Had he thought about me all these years? Or was he just part of another life, another family where I never existed? As I was wrapping up my workday, my phone pinged with a new message. This time it was from an unknown number. I opened it and my heart skipped a beat. "Hi, Katie, this is Josh. Dad gave me your number. I'd like to meet. I hope you don't mind." My heart raced. and I realized that the reality of the situation was becoming more tangible. I scrolled down slowly, and at the bottom of the message there was a photo. Him. Josh. I couldn't tear my eyes away from the image, studying the features of his face. Yes, he did look like me. The same chin shape, eye color, even a slight half-smile that mirrored mine. He was both familiar and entirely foreign. I stared at the screen for a long time, realizing I had been silently looking at his face for several minutes. My mind was racing. What would I say when we met? What do you talk about with someone who just entered your life but somehow feels like you've known them forever? I felt a growing sense of unease inside me. Meeting him could change everything, but at the same time I couldn't hold back the growing anticipation. As strange as it sounded, I wanted to meet him, to find out who he was and why. After all these years, we were standing on the brink of this introduction. Gathering my courage, I typed a reply. Hi, Josh. I'd like to meet too. Let's figure out a time and place. As soon as I hit send, I realized I had taken the first step into a new, unknown reality. I sat in the cafe in the city center, unable to shake the whirlwind of emotions swirling inside me. My heart beat faster than usual, and I kept nervously glancing around, trying to guess who among the people sitting around me might be my brother. We had agreed to meet here in this bustling place, but each time the door opened, I tensed up, expecting the person I'd never met, but who was somehow part of my life through distant echoes of the past. I thought I had prepared myself for this meeting, but as the time approached, everything spun out of control. My confidence vanished, replaced by doubt. What would he look like? What would we talk about? Could I act natural, or would I betray my nerves? A cup of coffee sat untouched on the table in front of me, but I hadn't even considered drinking it. I tried to calm myself, glancing around. People seemed immersed in their own lives. The usual hustle and bustle of a big city, where so many lives intersect fleetingly. But I couldn't focus. My mind was entirely on Josh, the man who had suddenly entered my life through a short message. When the door to the cafe opened again, I recognized him immediately. In the photos, he had looked similar to me, but in person, the resemblance was even more striking. His features, same chin, same eyes. He was taller than I had expected and carried himself with a calm confidence. He approached me with a light smile, which oddly enough helped ease some of my anxiety. "Hi, Katie," he said, sitting down. "Hi, Josh," I replied nervously, trying to catch my breath and stop looking so tense. But it was futile. Everything about this situation felt new and strange. He ordered himself a coffee, and as we waited, I noticed how easygoing he seemed, almost carefree. He didn't appear to be as anxious as I was. That surprised me because for me, this meeting was an encounter with something entirely new and unknown. Yet he seemed confident, as if he had already come to terms with the idea long ago. We started with general topics, the usual questions. How's life, work, what do you enjoy doing? It all felt too formal, even though we both knew a more serious conversation awaited us. My voice was still tense, but with each of his replies, I felt my anxiety easing slightly. But when the conversation shifted to our family, the atmosphere began to change. I gathered the courage to ask how he had learned about me and why he had decided to search. "I always knew I had a sister," he admitted, looking straight into my eyes. "It was one of those things I couldn't ignore. I've been searching for you for a long time, but I didn't have enough information. Only after Dad finally told you could I reach out." My thoughts immediately tangled. I didn't know how to react. The fact that he had known about me all this time, while I had lived in complete ignorance, stirred conflicting emotions within me. On one hand, I was touched by his persistence and the fact that he had been trying to find me. On the other hand, it made me feel strange and vulnerable, as if I had been part of his life while he had never been part of mine. "Why did you decide now was the right time?" I asked cautiously, feeling like he was holding something back. He leaned back in his chair and smiled. His smile was light, but there was something more to it. "I've always wanted to find you, but I didn't want to disrupt your life. I knew it could change everything, but I felt like now was the right time." I couldn't shake the feeling that there was more behind those words. Our conversation continued, but the tension between us didn't disappear. The more I looked at him, the more I realized that this meeting would be more than just a reunion with a brother. Something in his eyes and the way he spoke made me feel that this connection was deeper and stronger than I had anticipated. As we said goodbye, I couldn't shake the strange premonition. Josh wasn't just a brother I had just met. This connection felt like it would become something much more complex in my life. Life with Tom continued at its usual pace, but something had changed, and I could feel it. We still woke up together in the mornings, had breakfast, and talked about our plans for the day. Tom was always attentive and caring, but now it felt like his attention couldn't quite reach me, as if we were living in parallel worlds. Our life remained the same, but something new was stirring inside me, something strange and unsettling that I couldn't explain. Josh. His image, his words, his smile, everything about him was fixed firmly in my mind, and I found myself thinking about him more and more often. It started to bother me. Why was this man, whom I had only spent a few hours with, taking up so much space in my thoughts? Why couldn't I stop thinking about him? I tried to fight it, convincing myself that this was just a natural reaction to the unexpected discovery. But each day it became harder to ignore. Tom, of course, noticed something. He had always been sensitive and attentive. One evening, as we sat down to dinner, he suddenly said, "You've seemed distant lately. Is everything okay?" I flinched, not expecting such a direct question. The lie caught in my throat, but I still managed to mutter, "Everything's fine. I've just been a little tired." Tom frowned but didn't push further. His attempt to help touched me, and I felt a sharp pang of guilt in my chest. I didn't want to distance myself from him. We had been together for so many years, and he was a wonderful husband. But something inside me felt like it was breaking. "Maybe we should spend more time together," he suggested, handing me a glass of wine. "I know we've both been busy, but let's try to dedicate the weekends to just us." I smiled at him and nodded, even though inside everything was screaming. It would have been the right idea if I could fully be present here and now. But instead, I felt something unknown and strange pulling me, and that something was drawing me closer to Josh. Every time Tom hugged me, I felt the growing distance within me. We sat side by side on the couch, but I couldn't truly be with him. My mind kept replaying the memories of that day at the cafe with Josh. His words about searching for me for so long, his easy smile. It had become a magnet for my thoughts, and I couldn't shake them. The inner conflict grew stronger every day. I loved Tom, I knew that. But why then did my heart start to race whenever I thought of Josh? Why had guilt taken such a strong hold on me? I tried to convince myself that it was just a result of our sudden reunion, that we were only beginning to get to know each other as siblings. But something inside me whispered otherwise. My attraction to him was too strong to be just a sibling bond. One night, after Tom had fallen asleep, I quietly slipped outside, sitting on the porch and staring up at the stars. The cool wind brushed against my face, and I suddenly realized that my feelings for Josh were becoming something more than just a desire to know my brother. The thought hit me like an electric shock. I shivered from the realization and buried my face in my hands. How could I let this happen? How could I allow these feelings into my life? I knew this couldn't go on, but I couldn't find a way out. Every day my thoughts circled more and more around Josh, and I couldn't share any of this with Tom. I felt trapped in my own emotions, and the more I tried to hide them, the stronger they became. It all started with an unexpected message from Josh. I opened my phone and saw his short text. "Hey, Katie, I was thinking, maybe we could spend the weekend together? I have a country house. It would be great to get to know each other better in a more relaxed setting." My heart skipped a beat. The idea of meeting again was tempting, but the thought of spending an entire weekend with him, far from the city, filled me with a strange, uneasy feeling. Our cafe meeting had already changed so much, and this invitation felt even riskier. I stared at the screen for a long time, unsure of how to respond. Inside, doubts and fears swirled. Spending the weekend alone, away from everything, where no one could see or interrupt. This was clearly more than just an attempt to get to know each other as brother and sister. My inner voice whispered that these 2 days could be a turning point, and the thought terrified me. Tom was sitting nearby, busy with his own things, and for the first time, I considered lying to him. We had always been honest with each other. But now, as I looked at his calm face, I knew I couldn't tell him about Josh's invitation. I needed an excuse. Work trip? The words came to mind easily. If I told Tom I had to leave for a couple of days for work, he wouldn't ask any questions. We had been so busy lately, and such a lie seemed plausible. My heart clenched with guilt, but I saw no other way out. The next day, I told Tom that an unexpected work trip had come up. He accepted it without hesitation, as he always did. His complete trust in me was both a relief and a source of pain. I knew I was betraying that trust, even if nothing serious had happened yet. His casual, "Don't worry, everything will be fine," only deepened the conflict within me. When I received Josh's message with the address and time to meet, I realized there was no turning back. We had agreed that he would pick me up after work. The tension inside me grew with every passing hour, and I could no longer deceive myself. This weekend wasn't just about getting to know my brother. At the end of the workday, I walked out of the office with a heavy heart. The feeling that I was doing something wrong had haunted me all day. When I saw Josh's car in the parking lot, my heart raced even faster. He was waiting for me just as promised. Josh stepped out of the car, smiled, and, as always, looked confident. As he approached, he opened the car door and extended his hand. This simple gesture was filled with care and warmth, and once again, I felt the internal conflict surge. Why did my brother's touch make me feel so uneasy? "Hey, Katie, how was your day?" he asked, gently helping me into the car. "Hey," I replied, trying to mask my nervousness. "It was normal." As he sat behind the wheel and started the engine, a tense silence filled the car. We both knew that this weekend would change everything, even if neither of us fully realized just how much. We drove in silence, watching the scenery pass by. The city slowly disappeared behind us, replaced by vast fields and green forests. Josh looked calm and relaxed, but I couldn't shake the feeling of unease. The inner conflict between my mind and heart intensified with every mile. I tried to convince myself that I could handle it, that this was just a weekend with my brother. But the more I thought about it, the clearer it became that I was heading into dangerous territory. "This place is special," Josh suddenly said, breaking the silence. "You can really disconnect here. Just nature and peace." "That sounds nice," I nodded, though deep down I knew that peace was the last thing I'd find this weekend. Anticipation and fear swirled together. I was going not just to get to know my brother, but with a growing desire I couldn't suppress. The drive to the country house felt endless. We were winding through narrow roads, passing fields and sparse woods that gradually became denser. The landscape outside seemed to mirror my own emotions. With each passing mile as we moved further from the city, my internal anxiety intensified. Here, far from everyone and everything, I felt both free and vulnerable. Josh was focused on the road, but his presence beside me felt overwhelming. We exchanged casual remarks, joking about how far we'd driven from civilization. But beneath the surface, there was something deeper brewing. Our conversations became more personal, touching on topics we hadn't discussed before. I told him about my childhood, how I grew up never knowing about him, and in turn, he shared his thoughts about how long he had tried to find me. His words struck something inside me. I listened, but at the same time my mind was filled with questions. We were just brother and sister. This fact should have been the dominant one. But something in our interaction suggested there was more to it, something I was afraid to acknowledge. We rode in silence for a while when I suddenly felt his hand brush against mine. It was just a light touch, a fleeting moment, but it sent a jolt through me. I froze, trying to act as if nothing had happened, but inside everything turned upside down. Why had that touch elicited such a reaction in me? He was just my brother, whom I was only beginning to get to know. Or was he? I couldn't make sense of my feelings, and it scared me. Josh seemed not to notice my reaction or simply chose not to acknowledge it. But for me, that touch was a turning point. My heart started beating faster, and I tried to distract myself by looking out the window at the remote landscape. The further we moved away from the city, the less I felt connected to the reality I was used to. Here, there were no distractions, just the two of us and the nature surrounding us. "Have you ever thought about what might have been if we'd known each other earlier?" Josh suddenly asked, breaking the silence. I flinched at the unexpected question, but then nodded, trying to gather my thoughts. His question reminded me that all my thoughts in recent weeks had revolved around one idea. What would my life have been like if I had known about Josh all along? But this question was more than just family reflections. There was an undertone I couldn't ignore. "Yes," I answered quietly, trying to sound natural. "It's strange, meeting you now. It feels like we missed something important." He nodded, but kept his eyes on the road, which gave me the chance to hide my embarrassment. I didn't know exactly what he meant, but something inside me fluttered at the thought that our relationship was already moving beyond the boundaries of what siblings typically share. My hand still remembered his touch. It didn't feel accidental in my thoughts, and the more I dwelled on it, the stronger the tension became. We continued along the narrow, winding road with the trees growing denser around us, and I felt like I was becoming trapped by my own emotions. We were moving further away, and with each mile I felt like I was losing control over the situation. When we finally arrived at the house, I noticed how secluded the surroundings had become. The house stood on a small rise surrounded by thick trees, and it looked like a retreat hidden from the world. But for me, it was less of a retreat and more of a place where I would have to confront what I was afraid of. "We're here," Josh said, pulling me out of my thoughts. I exhaled, not realizing I had been holding my breath the entire time. He helped me out of the car again, and I felt his warm, steady hand on mine. That touch once again stirred the same unsettling feeling inside me. Josh's house was surrounded by dense woods, with a quiet lake nearby that mirrored the clear sky. This place felt isolated and peaceful, as if cut off from the rest of the world. The wind rustled softly through the leaves, adding to the serene atmosphere that enveloped everything around us. It felt as though time had stopped here, and I could have enjoyed this tranquility if it weren't for the growing tension inside me. Josh and I spent the day outside. We walked a lot, talked about life, laughed as we reminisced about the childhood we never had together. It was supposed to bring us closer as siblings, but in reality, something else was building between us, something that scared me and drew me in at the same time. Around noon, I realized I needed to call Tom. I knew he'd worry if he didn't hear from me. The signal here was weak, and I barely managed to get through. "Hi, Tom," I said when I finally heard his voice. "Everything's fine. How are you?" "Everything's okay. Where are you? Why is it so quiet?" His voice was calm, but I sensed an undercurrent of suspicion. I licked my dry lips, trying to think of an answer. Everything inside me resisted telling the truth, telling him I was in a country house with my brother, whom I'd only just met, far away from the city, alone? No, that would be too much. I hesitated, feeling my heart race. "The signal is bad here," I began, avoiding his question and staring at the trees as if hoping they could shield me from the guilt. "We're in the woods near a lake." "For work." "For work?" Tom paused for a moment, then spoke again. "You never mentioned this place. Are you sure it's for work?" I felt panic rise inside me. He had never been suspicious before, but now there was a hint of doubt in his voice. I couldn't tell him the truth. "Yeah, I'm here with some colleagues. We're meeting to discuss a project." I couldn't even remember what I was saying, just trying to avoid revealing too much. "The signal's really bad. I might not be able to call you often." "Where exactly is here?" Tom asked, his voice firm now. He wanted details, and I couldn't give them to him. "Oh, Tom, I can barely hear you. The signal's cutting out," I said, pretending I couldn't hear him. "We'll talk later, okay?" I hung up just as I heard him say, "Katie?" before the call dropped. My phone screen went dark, and guilt flooded over me. I had lied. At first, I just wanted to withhold the details, but now things had gone too far. The moment I ended the call, I felt torn between my duty to Tom and the pull that had brought me here, to Josh. I felt Josh's presence beside me. He stood a short distance away, watching as I spoke to my husband. His gaze was focused but not tense. It seemed like he knew how difficult it was for me to keep up this lie, but he didn't press. "Everything okay?" he asked softly when I lowered the phone. "Yeah, I didn't know what to say. The words stuck in my throat. Tom's worried. The signal is really bad. I understand, Josh said gently. This place is pretty isolated. The signal's always like this. He didn't ask any more questions, but I knew he could see how hard it was for me to deceive my husband. Yet, despite everything, there was still a part of me that wanted to be here with Josh. By the evening, when we returned to the house, the silence around us deepened. We sat on the terrace, soaking in the peace. The sky darkened, the first stars appeared, and the whole forest was enveloped in the coolness of the night. We spoke less, but the tension between us had grown, almost tangible. It felt like the air around us was thickening, ready to explode. I could feel Josh moving closer to me. His breathing became a little deeper, and I realized my heart was racing again. He stood next to me, and without saying a word, he slowly leaned in. His face was so close I could feel the warmth of his breath. Katie. His voice was barely a whisper. I didn't know what he was going to say, but I knew one thing. I wouldn't be able to resist this. Before I could think or act, he leaned in closer and gently, almost timidly, kissed me. The kiss was soft and tender, as if he wasn't sure I would respond. In that moment, I felt weightless. Two voices inside me battled. One screamed that this was wrong, while the other pulled me toward him with unbearable force. I wanted to pull away, and at first I did, trying to resist. But when I looked into his eyes, I saw the same struggle. And in that instant, all my fears and doubts vanished. I slowly responded to the kiss, allowing the moment to consume me entirely. The world around us seemed to disappear. It was just the two of us, and this shy yet profound kiss that turned everything in my life upside down. I knew I had crossed a line, but I couldn't stop. After our lips touched, time seemed to stop. I was frozen, unable to believe what had just happened. My body was motionless, caught between disbelief and shock. I could feel his breath near my face, the warmth of his hands, but I couldn't comprehend how we had reached this moment. It was all too unreal. The world around us fell silent, and I just stood there, paralyzed by the unexpectedness of it all. Inside, everything was in turmoil. Part of me knew this was wrong, but another part, the part that had long lived in the shadow of this attraction, couldn't resist. After what felt like an eternity, I pulled away. Inside me, a storm of emotions brewed. Shame, guilt, fear, and strangest of all, desire. I need to be alone, I blurted out quickly, avoiding his gaze. I turned and left for my room, not giving Josh time to respond. I couldn't stay near him a moment longer. Once inside my room, I shut the door behind me, my heart still pounding. I sat on the edge of the bed, trembling, unable to shake off the sensation of his lips on mine. That kiss. Had Josh planned it from the beginning? Or was it just a moment of weakness, as unexpected for him as it was for me? I lay down, staring at the ceiling. My thoughts raced. Everything that had happened seemed surreal. I tried to convince myself it was just a fleeting moment, that Josh hadn't intended for this to happen. But deep down, I knew something had changed. In that moment, I couldn't be sure if it was just weakness or if he had felt the same pull as I did. And if that was the case, where would this lead us? The next day, the tension between us only grew stronger. We spent the day in isolation, just the two of us, with nothing around but nature and silence. But the tension between us became unbearable. Every glance, every accidental touch only heightened the feeling. An inner voice screamed at me to stop, to pull away before things went too far, but I was already losing control. We walked by the lake, trying to act as though nothing had happened. Josh talked about his plans for the future, how he liked living away from the city, but I couldn't focus on his words. Every time he stopped and looked at me, something inside me froze. This was more than just affection or sibling closeness. It was a magnetic attraction I couldn't fight. By the evening, the tension was unbearable. We sat by the fireplace in the living room, the air around us thick with unspoken emotions. Josh looked at me in a way no one had ever looked at me before, with a gaze full of desire, and I couldn't help but respond. He gently touched my hand, and that touch sent a wave of warmth through me. I didn't pull away. Instead, I let his fingers trace along my skin. It was like electricity, powerful, destructive, yet irresistible. Josh leaned in closer, and I could feel his breath on my cheek. Everything inside me tensed as he kissed me again, but this time I didn't pull back. I simply allowed myself to be consumed by the moment, no longer able to resist. He carefully lifted me into his arms, and I felt his grip tighten as he carried me to the bedroom. I couldn't stop thinking about how wrong this was, but at the same time, how impossibly right it felt. We ended up on the bed with Josh above me. He gently but confidently ran his hands down my shoulders and then lower, and at that moment, I realized that I wanted nothing more than to continue this. I placed my hands above my head, feeling how my whole body surrendered to the wave of pleasure. I stopped thinking about everything, about my husband, about how destructive this was. In that moment, there was only him and what he was giving me. Josh knew exactly how to touch me so that I forgot everything. His movements were gentle but purposeful, and I felt how, with every touch, all the barriers between us crumbled. We gave ourselves completely to the moment, sinking into the forbidden feeling we could no longer control. When it was over, I lay there, staring at the ceiling, realizing what had just happened. Inside me, a storm of emotions raged, a mixture of guilt and satisfaction. I knew this was wrong, that we had crossed a line that should never have been crossed, but at the same time, I couldn't stop myself. It was inevitable. I woke up early in the morning as the first rays of sunlight gently filtered through the curtains. The silence in the house was almost deafening after a night filled with passion and contradictions. Lying in bed, I stared at the ceiling, feeling a strange emptiness inside. What had happened between Josh and me couldn't simply disappear like a bad dream. It was a reality that now felt unbearable. Josh was already awake. He sat at the edge of the bed, staring out the window. I could feel that this moment was inevitable. The conversation where we would acknowledge that everything that had happened was a mistake. I couldn't deny what I felt for him, but reason was starting to take over. "Katie." His voice was soft, almost uncertain. "We need to talk." I sat up, wrapping my arms around my knees, meeting his gaze. There was sadness and regret in his eyes. I knew what he was going to say, and I had been bracing myself for it, though my heart tightened in pain. "What happened? It shouldn't have happened," he began, speaking slowly, carefully choosing his words. "We can't let this continue if we want to maintain any sort of normal relationship. We're brother and sister. This is wrong." I stayed silent, trying not to let my emotions take control. It hurt, but I knew he was right. We had crossed a line from which there was no return, but for the sake of our futures, for the sake of not destroying each other's lives, we had to stop. "I understand," I exhaled, feeling the lump in my throat. "I know it was a mistake. We have to stop." A long pause followed. Josh looked like he had something more to say, but he hesitated. I saw his hands trembling slightly as he finally spoke again. "I need to tell you something. I have a wife." His words hit me like a shockwave. Everything I had been feeling, the guilt, the shame, the pain, suddenly intensified tenfold. A wife. He had a family, and he had hidden it from me this whole time. I looked at him speechless, as my thoughts scattered in every direction. "Why didn't you tell me sooner?" I whispered, feeling tears well up in my eyes. "I didn't want to complicate things," he began, but stopped, realizing how weak that sounded. "I'm sorry, Katie. I should have told you. But it doesn't change what happened between us." I couldn't speak anymore. It had all become too complicated, too destructive. We both knew that if we continued, it would ruin everything we had. We packed our things in silence and left the house. The drive back was entirely different. The tension that had once filled the car was gone. We had discussed everything, and, in a way, closed the chapter. The tension had disappeared, but in its place there was a hollow emptiness. I stared out the window at the passing landscapes, unable to focus. We were returning to reality, and now I had to resume my old life. But something inside me had changed. I couldn't go back to being who I was before. When we arrived at my house, I knew this would be the last time we saw each other like this. Josh gave me a silent nod as a farewell. I understood that for both of us, this was the end. We couldn't allow ourselves to repeat the mistake we had made. Back at home, I felt completely broken. Tom greeted me with his usual smile, hugged and kissed me. but I could no longer look at him the same way. Everything between us had changed, though he didn't know it. I tried to regain my old feelings, but instead, I only felt coldness. Josh and I had made the right decision. We decided to end things because we were brother and sister. But despite knowing this was the right decision, everything inside me screamed that I was no longer the person I had been. I had ruined my life, my family, and there was no going back. An invisible wall grew between Tom and me. We were no longer the people we were before that weekend. I knew this conversation with Tom was inevitable. Every day since we had returned from the weekend, I had been struggling to deal with what had happened between Josh and me. But the guilt and fear of being discovered wouldn't let me rest. Tom, as usual, was kind, attentive, and loving, and this only made my internal battle worse. I had to tell him the truth about having a brother. But how could I tell him everything else? We were having dinner, and I decided to finally speak up. "Tom, I need to tell you something." My voice trembled slightly, and I hoped he wouldn't notice. "I have a brother. His name is Josh, and I only just found out about him recently." Tom set down his fork, looking at me with surprise. It was like a thunderbolt out of a clear sky. "A brother?" he repeated. "You never mentioned you had a brother." I sighed, trying to gather my thoughts before continuing. "It's a long story. We never knew about each other. My dad told me recently, and we met." I pulled out my phone and showed him some photos of Josh. Tom scrolled through the pictures, but one of them caught his attention. It was a photo of Josh standing next to his car. "Wait," Tom said, staring at the screen. "I've seen this car outside our house. I thought it was someone from your work giving you a ride." I felt my mouth go dry and my heart began to race. Tom had noticed the car. The questions I had been dreading were ready to spill from his lips. "Why didn't you tell me about your brother right away?" he asked, his voice calm, but I could see the confusion in his eyes. "You've always been open with me." I didn't know how to tell you," I replied, trying to keep my composure. It was a shock for me, and I was just trying to process it. Tom kept looking at me, and I could tell he didn't fully believe me. He trusted me, I knew that, but something was bothering him. "Okay," he said, sighing. "But what were you two talking about all this time? I thought we told each other everything." That question pierced me. I knew I should be honest, but I couldn't tell him everything. My silence only deepened his suspicions. In that moment, I realized that despite Tom's trust, his intuition told him something wasn't right. And now his mind was turning toward my messages with Josh. He didn't say it directly, but I knew that sooner or later he would want to see what was in them. A few days later, I met Josh at a cafe. It was a place where we could talk freely, without prying eyes or ears. I didn't know how to start this conversation, but I knew it had to happen. "We need to stop this," I said, looking him straight in the eye. "This is wrong, and I think you know that too." Josh nodded, his face a mix of sadness and relief. He had clearly been thinking the same thing. "Yes, I understand," he replied. "What happened between us? It was intense, but we can't keep going. It'll destroy us both." I knew he was right. We had crossed a line that should never have been crossed, and now it was pulling us both down. Continuing these feelings meant ruining our lives, our families. "We need to stop all contact," I said, realizing this was the only right decision. "Not just physically. We need to distance ourselves completely." He nodded again, though I could see in his eyes that this decision was hard for him too. We both knew that what had happened between us wasn't just a mistake. It was a powerful, destructive feeling that couldn't be ignored. But if we wanted to preserve any semblance of normality, we had to end it. We said our goodbyes, and I walked out into the street, feeling like something inside me had broken. Yes, it was the right decision, but it was also painful. I knew that everything between me and Josh was over, but the consequences of this decision were only beginning to unfold. Meanwhile, Tom couldn't shake off his suspicions. He trusted me, but his intuition told him something was wrong. He remembered Josh's car, and the moments when I had been oddly silent. He knew there were conversations between us that he didn't know about. And now, despite his principles, he had decided that one day, when the opportunity arose, he would read the messages between Josh and me. His gut feeling told him that something important was hidden there. Tom remained outwardly calm and patient as always, but I could see that he had become more thoughtful and attentive. I sensed that something had changed in our relationship, and it was only a matter of time before he decided to find out the truth. Tom found the messages when I least expected it. I thought it was all behind us, that I had finally managed to bury the nightmare deep in my memory, and that Josh and I had closed that chapter for good. But when I came home that evening, I immediately knew something was wrong. Tom was sitting on the couch, staring grimly at the phone. My phone. My heart raced, and I felt a cold knot tighten in my stomach. His face was tense, and when he raised his eyes to meet mine, there wasn't a hint of warmth, just cold, icy confusion. "What is this?" he asked, his voice tight as he handed me the phone. I felt the world crumble around me. All my fears, all my attempts to hide the truth had been in vain. Slowly, I took the phone and looked at the screen. Our messages with Josh were open. Every message, every phrase we had written to each other discussing that night at the country house when everything went wrong. We talked about how it was a mistake, how it would never happen again, how it could destroy our families. But now, looking at those messages, I realized it had already destroyed my life. Tom stood up, snatched the phone from my hands, and hurled it against the wall. The crash was so sudden that I instinctively flinched. The phone hit the floor with a dull thud, the screen cracked. Inside, something broke, and I felt tears well up in my eyes. Tom's anger was overwhelming, but what was worse, the pain in his eyes, which I couldn't bear. "You betrayed me, Katie." His voice was low, but the pain bled through every word. "With my brother. How could you? We've always been honest with each other. How could you hide this?" I opened my mouth, but I couldn't speak. He was right. I had betrayed him. Everything I had done seemed so insignificant compared to this moment. Tom wasn't just angry, he was devastated. His trust in me had shattered, and I knew it wouldn't come back. "Or is he not your brother at all?" Tom continued, stepping closer, his voice rising. "Maybe he's just your lover? Was it all one big lie?" "No, Tom, it's not like that," I began, trying to explain, but he wouldn't let me finish. "Not like that?" He raised his hand, making me flinch. "Then what? You met him and suddenly you decided this was normal behavior? You could have told me from the start. Why didn't you say anything?" "I was scared," I whispered, knowing how weak that sounded. "I didn't know how to handle it. It only happened once. I didn't mean to ruin everything. It was a mistake." "A mistake?" His laugh was bitter, almost painful. "You're calling this a mistake?" "Katie, this isn't a mistake. It's a betrayal. You destroyed everything we built." He stepped even closer, and I felt his anger surge like a wave. His eyes were filled with rage, but beneath it there was deep pain. Pain I had caused. I couldn't find the words that could make this moment any easier. "I thought I could forget about it," I finally said, forcing myself to look him in the eye. "I was confused, Tom. I realized it was a huge mistake. It will never happen again." He didn't respond. His eyes stayed locked on mine as if he were trying to find some kind of explanation in my soul. But I knew there wasn't one. "Confused?" His voice shook with anger. "You just used that as an excuse. You thought I'd never find out? That you could hide this from me?" I stepped forward, desperately trying to find some sign of understanding in his eyes, but there was none. He turned away and paced around the room, as if trying to find a way out of a situation that had no solution. "You've destroyed everything," he finally said, his voice quieter now but no less painful. "I trusted you. I thought you were the one I'd spend my life with. And now, I don't know who you are." I couldn't hold back the tears any longer. I knew I had lost him. Everything we had built together over the years had come crashing down in a single moment. I stood there, broken and devastated by my own actions with no way to fix it. Tom stopped by the door, his shoulders tense. "I don't know what to do next," he said without turning around, "but I can't look at you the same way anymore." He left, leaving me in complete silence. I stood there for a long time, staring at the door, feeling the emptiness grow inside me. I had destroyed our life. It was all over. The house I was left alone in was the same as it had always been, but now it felt foreign. The silence pressed down on me, the emptiness surrounded me, and I couldn't find a place to hide from my thoughts. After Tom left, everything changed. Not just the house, but inside me as well. Inside, there was nothing left but hollow emptiness and regret. I wandered through the rooms as if seeing them for the first time. Everything reminded me of the past, of what our life had been before this moment, before I destroyed it all myself. Tom had been my world, my support, the person I trusted more than anyone. And now he was gone. I had destroyed our marriage, our family, and there was no way to fix it. I sat down on the couch, staring at the floor, and memories flooded back like an avalanche. Our first meeting, our years together, all the dreams we built, all of it was now in ruins. I had lost everything, and it was all my fault, Josh. His presence lingered in my thoughts. There was no longer a physical connection between us, but the emotional bond we had experienced didn't disappear. Our conversations, the kisses, the moments when we looked at each other, it all left a mark that was hard to erase. I knew that continuing with Josh was impossible, that it was destructive for both of us, but that connection clung to my soul. But I also knew that my past with him wasn't something that could help me in this situation. It was just a reminder of the abyss I had willingly stepped into. Josh wasn't only my mistake, but what had destroyed not just me, but his family and mine too. I was left alone with the consequences of my actions, and every day the heavy weight of guilt pressed down harder. The emptiness in the house reflected the emptiness inside me. Everything I valued, trust, love, understanding, was shattered. I had lost what seemed unshakable. My family had fallen apart, and I was left trying to figure out how to move forward. A few days passed, but I couldn't find a way out of this state. My life was in ruins, and I couldn't see how to piece it back together. Tom hadn't returned, and I knew he might never come back. I wasn't ready for this new reality, the reality where I had lost everything I loved. Every morning I woke up with a feeling that something was terribly wrong. My days became endless hours of reflection, regret, and trying to understand how I had let things go this far. I looked out the window at the lifeless trees and thought that perhaps my life had lost its spark too. The warmth I once felt with Tom was gone, just like him. My family was broken, and I knew there was no way to bring it back. My parents' house was quiet and peaceful, as it had always been. I came here to try to gather my thoughts, to escape from everything that was happening in my life. After Tom left and everything fell apart, I could no longer stay in that house, now filled with memories of what I had lost. My parents didn't ask too many questions. They didn't know the full truth, but they sensed that something was wrong with me. I asked them for some time and space, and they willingly gave it to me. Here, in the silence, I could finally think about everything. At first, I hardly left my room. I sat by the window, watching as autumn leaves slowly fell to the ground. The outside world was quiet, but inside me, emotions were still raging. Guilt, regret, pain. I tried to understand how I had gotten so lost in my feelings and how it had led to such a downfall. Josh. I thought about him a lot. Our meetings, our conversations, the tension that built between us. At first, I was sure it was a real connection, that these feelings were strong and genuine. But now, with distance, I began to realize that it wasn't like that at all. My feelings for Josh weren't born out of passion or love, but out of emotional vulnerability. I was thrown off balance when I found out I had a brother. I didn't know how to deal with that news, and instead of processing it, I dove into something bigger, something forbidden and risky. It became my escape from reality, from the problems in my relationship with Tom, from my own fears and doubts. Every time I thought about Josh now, it seemed distant and wrong. I realized I had misinterpreted my emotions. I confused the bond of family with something more because I wanted to find a way out of my own emotional turmoil. Now it was clear, but that clarity had come too late. My desire to be with Josh wasn't love. It was an attempt to fill the emptiness inside me. I wanted to feel needed, understood, important. But all of that was an illusion. I was wrong about my feelings, and unfortunately, I had destroyed everything I valued in the process. Weeks passed, and I slowly began to regain myself. I stopped trying to justify my actions and started accepting what had happened. I needed to acknowledge my mistakes and live with their consequences. My future was uncertain, but I knew one thing. I had to distance myself from Josh forever. No contact, no lingering thoughts of what had happened. We both made a mistake, and that mistake led to the destruction of our lives. Here, at my parents' house, I found something resembling peace. This place gave me the chance to rethink everything that had happened and try to understand how to move forward. I realized that the first thing I needed to do was to let go of the past. Josh could no longer be part of my life, and my feelings for him were nothing more than manifestations of my own weakness and fear of facing reality. I started to slowly return to life. Morning walks in the fresh air gave me time to reflect, to come to terms with myself. I began to feel a lightness that I hadn't felt in a long time. It was the start of something new, though I didn't yet know what that life would be. The only thing I knew for certain was that it had to be a life free from the mistakes I had made. I had been staying at my parents' house for several weeks, lost in thoughts and trying to begin a new life. This house had become my refuge, a place to hide from the pain and memories of a broken family. But one morning, everything changed. My mother entered the room smiling brightly, clearly excited. "Katie, we have a surprise for you," she said with such enthusiasm that I immediately felt uneasy. "Your brother Josh is coming to visit." I felt the ground fall out from under me. My parents had no idea that Josh and I had already met, that we had even spent several tense days together. A wave of discomfort and fear swept over me, but I forced a strained smile. "Really?" I replied, trying to keep my voice calm. "That's unexpected." "Yes, we thought it would be a great chance for you to get to know each other better," Mom said, beaming with happiness. She looked so pleased with herself that it was hard not to share her joy, even though all I felt inside was growing anxiety. When Josh finally arrived, the air between us was immediately filled with awkward silence. We exchanged quick glances, and in that moment I realized he felt the same. Our past, every meeting, every conversation came rushing back. But now we both knew that chapter of our lives was closed. My parents, blissfully unaware, acted as if everything was perfectly normal. They were warm and lively, as though nothing could shatter this familial bond they had envisioned. Josh and I stayed quiet more than we spoke, but sometimes our eyes met, and in those glances we both understood this had to stay behind us. During dinner I tried to engage in the conversation, but every time our gazes crossed, I felt a small jolt in my chest. But these weren't the same feelings as before. There was no attraction or desire, only the shadow of what once was, and the understanding that we had both grown past it. We'd crossed that line, but now we had the chance to leave it behind. My parents talked about plans for the future, how wonderful it was that our family was now complete, and how happy they were that Josh and I had finally found each other. Josh and I exchanged a brief glance, and I saw in his eyes the same resolution I had made, to keep the truth hidden for the sake of preserving this illusion of family. Later that evening, after my parents went to bed, I stepped out onto the terrace to get some fresh air and process everything that had happened that day. I heard the door behind me open, and Josh came out to join me. We stood there in silence, side by side. The quiet between us was heavy, but no longer tense. "I'm glad you're here," Josh finally said, his voice calm. "But I think we both know that what happened between us was wrong." I turned to face him, meeting his gaze, which no longer held the same tension as before. He continued, "No matter what, we need to leave it in the past. We can't let ourselves cross that line again. It was a mistake, and I think you understand that too." I nodded, feeling both pain and relief at his words. Yes, I understood. This was the right thing to do. We had made a mistake, and now it was time to acknowledge it and move forward. "You're right," I replied, sighing. "We can't undo what we lost, but we can start fresh, each in our own way." Silence fell between us again, but this time it was peaceful, comforting. We both knew this was the right decision. "We won't tell our parents," Josh added after a pause. "Let them believe their version of the story, their illusion." "Yes," I agreed. "It's better for everyone." We stood on the terrace for a few more minutes, exchanging brief farewell glances, knowing this was the end of something that should never have happened. But with it came a sense of relief, the knowledge that we would never again give in to the emotions that had once overtaken us. It was a hard lesson, but now we could both begin new lives, free from the past.